Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We've got some breaking news just now on the central economic policy of this Trump administration. In a huge blow to the White House and its agenda, and a big win, I would say, for everyone else, a federal appeals court has just ruled that Trump's sprawling tariffs are unlawful and invalid. Of course, the president has been obsessed with imposing his willy-nilly tariffs on Americans. In fact, it has been the central plank of his entire economic agenda. Now, it has been wildly unpopular. It's polling underwater. It is costing consumers and corporations billions and billions of dollars by the day. It's stopping the Fed from cutting interest rates by driving inflation. It has, on the whole, been really bad economic policy. And most of the discussion of these tariffs have been focused on that. But there's also something about these tariffs, which is that from the jump, they've been pretty clearly illegal. I mean, think about it for a second. Can the president just by himself create tariffs that raise hundreds of billions of dollars with zero congressional input? These tariffs are a violation of the law that they purport to use as the justification, and a violation of the spirit of the Constitution of a country which was quite literally founded on the belief the executive cannot unilaterally just impose a tax without representation, specifically tariffs. Now, the Trump administration has claimed that its tariff regime and the reciprocal tariffs that it has, and those on China and Mexico and Canada, that those are an emergency measure under a 1974 law, and that made it illegal. Well, when this was challenged in a district court, the district court judge said, no way, this does not comport with the law. So the Department of Justice, acting as Trump's lawyers, appealed. And now, just 20 minutes ago, in a huge development, an appellate court has just upheld that ruling 7-4, the federal appellate circuit, saying it is illegal. All the tariffs you're citing are illegal. The emergency you claim is not a valid basis to break the law. Neil Katyal argued this case on behalf of the plaintiffs who just emerged victorious. He previously served as acting Solicitor General of the United States, and he joins me now. Neil, frame the argument that you made and what the court said about those arguments.
Yeah, so I want to begin, Chris, by saying, like you started by saying it's a blow to the President Trump. The way I really think of it is it's a win for the Constitution, and it's always, a very serious, sober thing when you challenge presidential action, and something you have to do really carefully. But when we looked at this, and I'm privileged to represent a number of small businesses, we looked at it and said, look, this just is way beyond the constitutional pale. And that's what the 7 judges today said on our nation's second highest court. They looked at it and said, the president under our Constitution is given no power to impose tariffs. Our founders expressly gave that to the Congress in Article 1, Section 8. And President Trump himself recognized that last time when he was president. He went and asked Congress for the authority to tariff, and they said no. So President Trump this time around just did it on his own. And what we said is you can't do that under the laws and Constitution of the United States. And that's what I'm glad to see the court reaffirm today.
Yeah, I thought this is an interesting phrasing. This is the federal circuit, which is an interesting and unique appellate circuit that deals with certain jurisdictions, including international trade. They talk about the 5 executive orders that impose tariffs and they say unlimited duration on nearly all goods from nearly every country in the world. Which I thought was, when you put it like that, you think to yourself, yeah, that does seem like a pretty broad claim of executive authority.
Yeah, as broad as it could get. And I think this is one thing that the judges were concerned about, and certainly we've been thinking about, which is the Trump administration is saying they want to bring this case to the Supreme Court. And this U.S. Supreme Court for many years has been saying, in particular with respect to a lot of different President Biden's initiatives, these questions are too major for the president alone to decide. They have to be done by the Congress. And here you got something as major as it gets. The Nonpartisan Tax Foundation says that these tariffs are the largest tax increase on Americans since Bill Clinton in 1993. And yet Congress had nothing to do with them. It's just President Trump and the stroke of his pen. And that just can't be the right way to run a constitutional system.
It's been interesting to cover this as we have, because so much is focused on the concrete effects. I mean, right now, if you're buying coffee, for instance, you notice that coffee's gotten very expensive. We don't grow a lot of coffee in the U.S. There's a little bit in Hawaii, but we import a huge amount of coffee. That coffee is being tariffed. So there's all sorts of effects. But the discourse didn't really talk about the legal foundation. The argument that they're making is that there's a 1974 act that allows them to declare an emergency under which they can impose these tariffs. But what's interesting about that act is it doesn't use the word tariff at all. It's entirely about sanctions on essentially countries that we have some geopolitical adversarial relationship with, right?
You're exactly right, Chris. You're doing excellent lawyering. I suspect it's in part due to your spouse, who's an amazing lawyer in her own right. But that's exactly right. The government is saying, in this case, the Trump administration is saying that in 1977, Congress passed a law that gave the president emergency economic powers. And the court today said, yeah, that's true. There's only one problem with that. That 1977 law says nothing whatsoever about tariffs. No president in the 50 years since that law was passed thought it had to do with tariffs. And as I said a moment ago, even Donald Trump didn't think it had to do with tariffs, because the first time around when he was president, he went to Congress to try and get the tariff authority that he's now asserting. And Congress said no. And I suspect, he's worried Congress would say no if he asks again, for all the reasons that you were explaining earlier.
One of the things here, and I want to read again from this decision here, that this is the sort of core of the holding. For the reasons discussed above, we discern no clear congressional authorization by IEEPA, that's the 1977 law for tariffs, of the magnitude of the reciprocal tariffs and the trafficking tariffs. Reading the phrase regulate importation, which is the statutory language they're citing, to include imposing these tariffs is a wafer-thin reed on which to rest such sweeping power. How confident were you about winning this case? I mean, you obviously had the lower court on your side, but also courts have been fairly deferential to presidential declarations of emergency powers.
Yeah, no, when you're challenging presidential action, if you're the president facing these challenges, you almost have to try to lose the case. It's like failing kindergarten. You got to try. But I think that's unfortunately where we were here. And that's why, I'm privileged not just to represent this myself, but with a whole group of very conservative folks. The Liberty Justice Center is the entity behind this, a libertarian organization. Judge Michael McConnell, a very prominent former judge, very conservative. It's not, this is, when you get to something like this, Chris, the Constitution is not political. It's a
big defeat for President Trump. Breaking news in our Money Lead. A federal appeals court has just ruled against President Trump's sweeping global tariffs, saying he unlawfully leaned on emergency powers to impose tariffs. President Trump just reacted to the tariff ruling, saying that all tariffs are still in effect. He called the appeals court highly partisan and said that the United States Supreme Court was going to get involved. Let's bring in Neil Kochel. He represents some of the plaintiffs in this case. He's also the former acting U.S. Solicitor General for President Obama. Neil, your reaction to the ruling, your reaction to President Trump seeming to suggest that he's going to appeal this to the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, we're just studying the ruling. I had the privilege of arguing it on behalf of the Liberty Justice Center and a group of private plaintiffs, Jake. And I guess I'd start by saying I don't view this as you started by saying it's a defeat for President Trump. I think the way to think about it is it's a win for the American Constitution, that our founders basically said that decisions that are major over things like taxation have to be done by the Congress, not by the president and the stroke of his pen. And the idea, as President Trump says, that this is like some highly partisan court or something. I mean, the senior most judge in the majority to rule against Donald Trump was a guy appointed by President Bush, Judge Lurie. So I don't buy that whatsoever. I think the court overwhelmingly today in a 7-4 decision rejected President Trump's notion that he can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and have said, no, the Constitution imposes limits. And one really important limit, Mr. President, is you're not allowed to tariff on your own.
President Trump also said in that Truth Social post that he thinks tariffs are the best tool to help American workers and support companies. Your clients whom we interviewed the ones who are wine sellers in Manhattan. They disagree very strongly.
Exactly. So they do disagree and, do think that the tariffs are harmful. But I think what the court today said is, look, if the president thinks these tariffs are so important, and today I guess he said they're going to destroy the country if you don't have the tariffs, then make that case to Congress. That's what every president has done before him. Indeed, it's what Donald Trump did the first time around when he was president. When he was in his first administration, he went to Congress and tried to ask for tariff authority. And what they say, Jake? They said no. And so if this is so important, he's got, the Congress is controlled by the Republican Party. That's his party. Go make the case there, but don't distort the Constitution in the process. And it's always, I think, a fraught, heady thing when you're going in a court and saying the president did something illegal. You only want to do so in the rarest and gravest of circumstances. But Jake, as we looked at this case, that is this situation. You've got the president who's imposed the largest tax increase on American consumers since 1993 in the form of these tariffs. That's according to the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation.
Is he going to be happy? And he's going to be threatening the judges and whatnot, right? I'm predicting that. That's why there's question marks in the title. But I think after this ruling, he's going to be furious because he clearly overstepped his bounds. And look, part of this, I don't love doing this, but this isn't all Trump's fault. Part of this is Congress's fault. That Congress, in an effort to sort of, a generations-long effort, to sort of relinquish its own power to the executive, basically gave up on actually doing its job with regard to tariffs. Tariffs are not actually an executive thing, not purely. Like with anything, the president and his executive is responsible for managing like the day-to-day government. So if there are tariffs, their job is to, enforce them and ensure that they're working and, police them to make sure that other countries are not dodging the tariff, whatever, like that sort of thing. Much like how Congress passes a budget, and then it's the executive's job to go out and actually spend the thing based on the laws and whatnot, right? But with this, Trump went so far. He went so far, guys. Congress has given presidents power to deal with tariffs, but this unilateral approach that he's done is flying in the face of the courts. And Trump is furious. And it doesn't have to be rational, but I know he's going to start threatening his own Supreme Court judge. It wasn't even their decision, but he's going to start threatening them. I guarantee you. And if you think you'd only threaten the 3 liberals, you're foolish. If anything, he's been harder on the 6 conservatives. Because sort of correctly so, he knows that, he's never going to convince the 3 liberals. And if they're voting with him on something, it's usually like a unanimous type decision that the courts still have sometimes. And he doesn't need to put any pressure because some rulings really are sort of black and white, either against or for Trump. But it's those 6 judges, including his bestest buddy Clarence, that every once in a while gets the urge to vote against him, and he'll put the pressure on. And if you think, well, Krista, you're being a little exaggerative there, and I'm like, I don't think so. You've seen what this man has done. His movement, at least, threatened the daughter of a judge when he was on trial back last year, right? They threatened staff, not just the judges and the prosecutors. Somebody would be a random clerk and their picture would be all online, and Trump's family in some cases would be sharing it, and they'd be like, this person works here and there, and then all of a sudden their phone number would be leaked and all of that, right? You don't think he'll threaten his own Supreme Court judges?